Welcome again to Philosophy15. I'm Robert Talisse, and this is
Scott Aikin.
We are the authors of the book Why We Argue and How We Should, A Guide to Political Disagreement. And this podcast is an attempt for us to speak uninterruptedly, but with substance about philosophical issues. The last discussion we had was about the unity of the virtues thesis, and what we quickly discovered in trying to talk about the unity of virtues thesis is that we weren't altogether sure what the thesis is supposed to be, and so we had come up with, if I'm recalling correctly, two different versions, or two main versions of the thesis with variants within each. One is the Platonic version. There's only one virtue, and what look like the multiplicity of virtues are really just different aspects of that same. And then there's the Aristotelian version, which comes in different strengths, I suppose, which says that the perfection of any one virtue requires either the perfection of every other virtue or a sufficiently developed degree of every other virtue.
Right.
So we're first wondering about whether this is a plausible view in its own right, and then last time we left off with the worry that sometimes we could think of as the value pluralist worry, or the Fox's worry, that not all of the virtues are compossible, or that one cultivates, with respect to some virtues, one cultivates that virtue only at the expense of the ability to manifest, maybe to any degree, but certainly to a sufficient degree, some of the other virtues, or some other virtue.
So, in the same way in which the hedgehog knows one good strategy, and the fox may know a couple or know many, we also asked the question: okay, so what are the consequences if you, regardless of whether or not the unity of the virtues thesis is plausible? It's one of the questions. We had the question as to what it is, what it means. One of the other questions is, what are the consequences if the unity of the virtues thesis is true? What follows? And one of the questions we asked was, okay, if the virtues are unitary, are the vices unitary? And so that's what we're going to be talking about a bit today. If the unity of virtues thesis is true, is there something that you might say would be the unity of the vices? Or is the unity of, what would the unity of vices thesis be? And would it be plausible? So let's start with maybe the unity of vices thesis. So we'll share like a thought, right?
Okay.
Right. And the thought was, and we had talked a little bit about this outside of the podcast or outside of the video cast circumstances, where we'd said, there's something plausible about both the unity of the virtues thesis and the unity of vices thesis, that you'd say, while watching some show on reality television, that you see somebody of particularly bad character. And we just say particularly bad character. We don't name any vice. We just say bad character.
Fill in your own favorite example.
Right. And you say, well, look, I saw this guy lie to his wife, and I saw him cheat. I saw him cut somebody off in traffic, and I saw him be ungrateful to somebody. Of course, this person then, as a consequence, cheats on his friends and doesn't do his work around the house, or steals. Of course, right? I see this feature of terrible character in these places. Why am I surprised whenever I see it in these other places?
Yeah, and I guess that we do, again, to speak slightly in favor of the unity of the vices thesis, we do sort of have that, like, what did you expect thought.
Right.
When people are surprised, when we are aware of somebody's particular vices, and then are surprised when they exhibit a new vice.
Another, right.
it almost is like, of course,
Yeah.
of course he's also a cheater.
That's right.
He's a liar.
Yeah, Aesop had that famous fable about the scorpion, right? The fox is standing on the fox gives the scorpion a ride across the river, and he says, "You're not going to sting me." And the scorpion says, "Of course I won't sting you. It would be stupid for me to sting you." And he stings this fox, and the fox says, "Why did you sting me?" And the scorpion says, "I'm a scorpion. Come on."
Yeah, right.
So it looks
What did you
like
expect?
this. Right. What did you expect? So again, in the same way in which there's something plausible to the unity of the virtues thesis, that there's a kind of thought behind it that you can at least think your way into. The unity of vices thesis, it looks like there's something to it also. Maybe it's less a kind of conceptual relationship.
That's right.
And more a kind of a probabilistic
Or just a
relationship.
psychological regularity.
Right.
It's like where you find certain kinds of bad character traits. Part of the explanation of the manifestation of those bad character traits is an upbringing, a background that was a ground for the cultivation
Right.
of lots of other bad habits.
Virtues may come as packages, and
Right.
vices may come as nests.
Right.
Right. Okay. So at the very least, we see what's plausible about that. That you might say that there's something that you might say something like being virtuous and being honest look like you couldn't be. It looks like honesty looks like should be at the sort of the core of these sorts of things. Dishonesty might have a similar kind of feature to it. But now let's kind of start asking the same kinds of questions that we had about the
Right.
unity of the virtues thesis. Can you kind of imagine one of the vices on its own without, and maybe even in conjunction with a virtue, right?
So an honest coward,
Right.
for example.
Good. So somebody who says I'm a coward and is totally honest about it, or
Right.
the you might call it the virtue among thieves phenomenon,
That's right.
Where it's like, in order for you to be a particularly good thief, sometimes you need to work in conjunction with other ones, and so you need to be honest with them about what you'll be doing, or you need to. Okay, so it looks like honesty looks like it's consistent with some of these other vices.
Right, but I guess we still have to make a distinction, right, between how strong the unity thesis is supposed to be in either of the cases, right?
Yeah.
So is it that a fully treacherous person,
Right.
right, has to have no virtues and all of the vices?
Right, and so you imagine that they may have honor among thieves, but it would be honor in sort of scare quotes, where it would just be honor only insofar as they allow me to pull off this caper or something like that, or pull this thing off.
Right.
And then once it's over, then they get treated dishonestly, and so it would work more like a con or something like that. Right.
Right. Okay, but it could also be honor among thieves with the thieves in quotation marks too. Like the person has not perfected. Here's where I think we get a clue as to what the asymmetry is between virtues and vices. Because when you say he hasn't perfected his thieving character, something seems to me, at least to my ear, let's just say, was not a good philosophical argument, but maybe the beginning of some, that there's something puzzling about the idea of a vice being perfectible. Right?
Yeah.
And I take it that on a standard, maybe not every, but on a standard Aristotelian account, the vices not only aren't, there is no unity of the vices because there couldn't be. Because if the unity of the virtues thesis is the thesis that the perfection of any virtue requires either the perfection of every other or a sufficient development of every other, it looks as if the unity of vices thesis, vices are not the kinds of things that are states of perfecting.
So it requires a philosophical theory to see why this is the case. But you're saying in effect a perfect vice is a kind of contradiction.
I think that's got to be right.
Right.
Yeah.
You can imagine someone saying something like, he's perfectly virtuous, but there's something, because they're deficiencies, right? By hypothesis, a vice is a deficiency. It's not perfectible. Now, I guess you might say my flat-footed response, right? It's like if I'm not looking at it or hearing it through the philosopher's ear, it doesn't sound like an inconsistency, right? It's only once I say, well, I've got a theory about what virtues are and vices are, now it looks like a contradiction. maybe that's evidence that our theory is screwy, right? Instead of thinking of vices as like virtues as positive states of character, whereas vices are effectively privations or something like that.
Perversions, even.
Right. Maybe think of vices as positive, like an actual state, not a positive in the ethical valence, but positive in, you might say, the metaphysical valence. Right. There is such a thing as being dishonest. Right. Instead of it's just a failure of being honest, it's a right, again, dishonest looks like it's already sort of got the negation built into there. So let's think here, like thieving then. Thievery is a case where it looks like that would, like being a perfect thief, it looks like you might say is a case where you get what you want regardless of people's inclinations or their notions of privacy. Why is that a privation?
Well, let me think of it this way. So maybe this is more of a Platonic argument than is strictly Aristotelian.
Yes.
Although maybe Aristotelians could avail themselves of this kind of thought as well, that it would be difficult to make sense of the perfect thief without reference to his ability to know certain things, accurately observe certain. Certainly, when it comes to the kinds of epistemic states, he's got to have to be a good thief.
You have to have theoretical virtues
to be a morally vicious person. That seems
right. Yeah. So we'll agree there, right?
So even just
we can just say like the unity of the moral vices instead of the right. So make the moral vices their own sorts of things, and say that you have to have certain epistemic virtues to be morally vicious, or perfectly morally vicious.
Now the worry is that once we make that move, that the perfectly vicious person, if there is such a person, has to nonetheless have certain kinds of epistemic virtues. The perfectly vicious person has to have epistemic virtues. Then I worry that we're already
there's
denying...
something Socratic wants to Socratic in me wants to deny that, and there's a kind of a Kantian kind of thought behind it too, which is that just for the sake of intellectual consistency you don't do that, but now let's again sort of weaken the view and say, well, maybe I can dial down the epistemic virtues. I don't have to be perfectly epistemically virtuous. I can just be epistemically virtuous enough to be able to identify my best means to these ends. I reason well enough to be able to identify them, and my ends are getting that person's stuff or convincing that person to do what I want to, regardless of the truth. Why is that?
Well, again, I think there's a Socratic.
There's a kind of
getting that person's stuff by convincing him. You've got to, you've got to care about getting things right in order to pull it off. Yeah, this is what makes con men so
strange,
so morally odd, right? It's sort of.
There's a kind of a Frankfurt thought behind this too, right? Which is that in order for you to properly lie, you have to care a lot about the truth, right?
That's exactly right. Right.
So maybe bullshit would be the place where the vices would be most profound. The bullshitter doesn't care about the truth. The bullshitter just cares about seeming a certain way and getting something.
Right.
Philosophy 15, making a mess of it.
See you next time.